All right, I want to give my bit on the United States versus Microsoft. Whoa, where does this come from? Ancient history, especially in terms of computer technology, the speed that goes. Well, there have now been a few videos that have gone up regarding this topic, but specifically a very close friend of mine, also a YouTuber, well, he had some very valid questions that I feel that should be answered. After all, he did have a specific request that I do a video response. So here's what I know, beyond what's already history, let's say. The questions asked, or they're posed in a manner of saying, well, was Microsoft being punished for being successful? A lot of people do ask those kinds of things, especially when a company is number one in their market, so on and so forth. And this gets into a lot of ideology. I did post one of my favorite ideologies, which does come from Milton Friedman at the beginning of this video. And he took a stance of being very favorable to antitrust laws to very unfavorable for things that he saw that in essence, they did the very opposite of what their intentions were. And they always say that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Anyway, back to the topic at hand, a lot of the questions that I saw in the video are posed around Microsoft being a monopoly, and monopoly being a bad thing, so on and so forth. Well, there is nothing illegal or wrong with being a monopoly. For example, there are monopolies that are backed by government. So it is not the issue of Microsoft being a monopoly, even though it is legally declared as one by the Department of Justice. The other thing is that people are sort of confusing a couple of cases. There was a very early case before the whole deposition of Gates and all that, before they got into the 1998 and all that, where the Department of Justice went after Microsoft for how it handled its licensing with OEMs. In that, to have an agreement with Microsoft, the OEM would pay a royalty to Microsoft. Makes sense, right? Hey, the OEM's installing or using Windows on their computer and therefore selling that computer to a consumer, and Microsoft wants a piece of the pie. Okay, but what about computers that do not have the Windows operating system on board? Microsoft was requesting, and through the contracts, another royalty from the OEM to pay them, even though Windows was not on the machine. So the agreement is, if I'm an OEM, that I must pay a royalty to Microsoft for each computer I sell, whether or not it had the Windows operating system on it. The other allegation the Department of Justice had in that case, and we're talking about, again, a 1994-95 case, was that if you're a software vendor and you're doing an application for Windows, and some of their agreements with these, what we call ISVs, independent software vendors, they would be prohibited from doing that application work with anybody else, pretty much. They couldn't do any work for any competitors at all. So, on those two things, and there was other stuff to the case, you can clearly see interference, which violates antitrust laws dictated within the Sherman Act. Section 1 would be like a contract that would restrain trade. And then the second section would stipulate a person or entity that would monopolize trade, as in to interfere and restrain it, of course, because it is not illegal, again, to be a monopoly. And in that case, the Department of Justice did not go after Microsoft and how it ascended to be a monopoly either. The words even used within the case where the Department of Justice saw how Microsoft acquired such power was fortuitous. So that is not why Microsoft was put on trial. So the result of that case is that Microsoft agreed to behave. Let's just put it that way. Of course, then we come to the famous case where we see all the YouTube videos of Mr. Gates doing this, the rockabye baby thing, and being accused of mumbling, so on and so forth, not giving concise answers, yada, yada, yada. Much of that case had to do with the browser wars, okay? It is not the fact that they are monopoly in itself. It is how they use the power that they have by being that monopoly and using it against others. Very specifically, in which was tried, in that case, to remove Netscape and any other competing browser. Okay, so the question was, well, is Microsoft being punished for bundling Internet Explorer to every copy of Windows? No. If it were left at that, and if you read the findings of fact, and it was by a judge by the name of Judge Jackson, I think is the name. If you read his findings of the facts, it goes through an order of things, saying, well, if Microsoft left it at that, okay, but they did this. And even if they left it at that, they went on and did this. So, for instance, it is in the finding of facts that, yes, Internet Explorer was bundled with all of the Windows copies. That in itself, however, rose concerns with OEMs in that their specific consumers didn't necessarily want Internet Explorer and liked other browsers. And there were licensing agreements where Microsoft specifically would hurt or favor the company based upon their decision of whether they're going to support giving Internet Explorer preference or ignoring the promotion altogether, all Microsoft's demands, and going with whatever they want. Take Compaq, for example, trying to go with AOL, and then the whole Netscape Navigator where they would have the icons, because there was an argument of OEMs on how they didn't want to get dictated to by Microsoft on how they would package their own computer, even though it was running Windows. There was a lot of latitude given in terms of boot sequence and what splash screens could come up, some help, organizational things, how to run the computer, stuff like that. A lot of these OEMs could specifically do. But Microsoft would move in a direction, again, that would directly harm or favor a company based upon their actions and how they felt about allowing Internet Explorer to be bundled with Windows with the whole demands that Microsoft had stipulated with the icons, and you can't have third-party stuff here in our start menu, don't mess with our boot sequence, this and that. Now, you can maybe even say, well, look, that's the part of just doing business with Microsoft, and why not pick somebody else? According to the United States government, there really wasn't any other significant player in the Intel x86 market. So the Department of Justice is stating to them, or to Microsoft, and saying, well, where else are they going to go? It's either going out of business or listen to you, as an end result. An example of which was Gateway, where they refused to do the whole Internet Explorer preference, and they ended up paying one of the highest licensing fees to use Microsoft Windows. Let's say versus Compaq, which actually had I believe the lowest for quite a long time, because they did favor Internet Explorer. So they got incredibly great prices on their Windows licenses. You could get into details of such where Netscape itself wanted to run on Windows, and technical information at key points was withheld from Netscape, thereby giving much lead time to Internet Explorer to get a bigger head start before Netscape could even become installed within the Windows operating system. Now, there will be others that say, well, Internet Explorer was given away for free. That wouldn't be so much an issue if the other details where Microsoft clearly, by using the channels within the OEM, interferes. That's why they were sued. They would interfere in how Netscape could get on their OEM partners through all those channels. Giving something away free, no, not so much. When you are monopolizing because of your size and setting the rules of the game to say, you simply cannot do this. So there are issues where the Department of Justice would present conversations and memos, emails, where it clearly shows Microsoft targeting Netscape and using their power to control OEMs, and how it could just suffocate Netscape. It would just literally suffocate them. That would be a violation of the Sherman Act. You are restraining trade and monopolizing to interfere with trade at that level. There isn't really a problem that Microsoft is the richest guy on the block. They have so much resources, they have an operating system, this and that, they do all kinds of other products. But when you abuse the power of that to say, well, we're going to revoke your license to sell Windows if you don't put Internet Explorer versus anyone else as the main guy for everyone to see. You just won't be able to sell our products. It's very different to say than, look, we would like you to have the icon and it should be in this place. And then probably argue with the OEMs and saying, well, yeah, I understand it may cause confusion that there's other icons there and they are trying to choose an internet access provider. The OEMs would have an argument saying, well, look, can we do this and that? There's a lot of room where Microsoft can legally get away with saying, look, we want to have Internet Explorer do this and this and this, and you know what, we'll give you some help here or there or whatever. I can accept that. But when you directly threaten companies and change up licenses, withhold technologies because of the size that you are, and that everybody uses your operating system within the Intel x86, is a violation of the Sherman Act. Now, there's the whole thing where people are talking about how Netscape performed. And the finding of facts is not so much that, other than there was an argument in saying, well, since a browser is already on the operating system, your everyday consumer is not really going to want to go and download the browser. Okay? Although, post the case, there were many people that came out and presented download statistics of daily downloads of Netscape, so on and so forth. After all, I would argue this. In line with the first statement that I gave, as Milton Friedman had stated, the outcome of the case is pretty much moot. Microsoft controlled 90-something% of the market of browsers, and while Netscape died, here comes Firefox. And it's been grabbing huge chunks. Wow, Microsoft had much larger share than Netscape itself when IE was the underdog. Okay? While that point could be argued, much of the critics of the case would say, well, Microsoft is just going to, and it will lose by committing suicide in itself, business suicide in itself. And not enough was done, this and that. Well, taking that and not enough is done, then Microsoft could very well do it again. I know that the decrees were supposed to have expired in 2007, and they extended it a couple of years, right? So, again, really, what's to say that Microsoft doesn't do this kind of negotiations with OEMs and so on and so forth? But heck, Firefox has grown and thrived on relatively, I would say, very little resources in comparison to Microsoft, and has made a monumental achievement. Also, many things in the internet have changed. Google came out of nowhere, and I'm sure took Microsoft by surprise. And MSN, I would dub pretty much a failure, and thus we have Bing and this and that. So many things change, and that's like the whole point. Like, I love how Milton Friedman said, does really Silicon Valley want to go to the government? Because once you go that route and then government gets involved, it's gonna just spread like a cancer and start controlling everything within the computer arena. In that, which I thought was a brilliant statement, by the time everything gets done and said in a trial, technology has moved on so fast that the original points of the case are moot. Exactly what my point is in saying. And I would side with Microsoft in part in where we'll get back to some of the specifics in saying, well, it was tied to their operating system. Internet Explorer 4 really was tied to the system. Microsoft, and Gates especially in his deposition, did a very poor job. Well, although it's not necessarily favorable to the person getting asked, I would say that Internet Explorer to Microsoft meant more than just what many of us understand a browser is to be. Internet Explorer represented internet technologies. And I knew at the time, because I was becoming an MCSE, all this other stuff, and in the thick of all of this, I've experienced the differences between the days of Netscape and Internet Explorer. And yes, as a developer early on, I couldn't stand Netscape. It was slow to catch up with some of the technologies that Internet Explorer had, and then of course everything evened out, and then Netscape would leap ahead, and then Microsoft would then come up, and these versions were firing off. But I found like ActiveX to be very powerful, and Java was a problem to have because Microsoft even controlled how Java would behave on its system. They didn't want to accept the Sun standard, so they made their own little private gateway into their system. And that's really Microsoft's way. They see something like a standard and they say, no. Even though the rest of the world you want to use that standard like that, you're going to have to do something different for us. And the end result being that you have a Java flavor for Microsoft that doesn't work on anybody else, and then you have a Java flavor that works on everybody else but not for Microsoft. These kinds of things. But I will say that the technology was just advancing so fast. We had ActiveX's, and then especially which came like the Quick Launch Bar, the Active Desktop, Windows Update, heavily were used as the companies that I worked at. And here came a lot of the security holes, which just completely led to what Microsoft came to know with all these viruses and things. I have videos on how market share really has very little to do with the viruses and the history and the context of what Microsoft was doing, because in the browser wars it was a race. Security was a secondary thought. They just wanted to get feature, and not think about the consequences of what that feature would have. Thus, ActiveX has presented major security breaches. Active Desktop, publishing of any type of web technology within email, so on and so forth, just opened the gateway, boom. And when they integrated Internet Explorer 4, they did so at many compromises to the system itself. It left a lot of security breaches and holes within Windows itself by just shoving Internet Explorer 4 in there so quickly, not really, again, considering the consequences. And they paid for it. by getting that reputation of such buggy and security and all these other things. So it was very, very, very rapid. The other thing was that why I side with Microsoft is I knew the vision that they were trying to go. Gates saw the internet as like this new application world, and they wanted to be able to be the number one forerunner of it, and tried to make Windows address it at its lower levels. I mean, within itself, its guts. You wanted to be able to have all kinds of push technologies inside it, anything related with the internet technologies, where I don't want to go into such detail, but anything internet related, whether sending or receiving, it wanted to even do at the OS level rather than just a browser. And I could say that's innovative in thought and wanting to do so. It's just the execution and how they and the whole about it. And then saying, well, it is tied, and no, it's not tied, and evidence submitted, and oh, well, that was a wrong screenshot, this and that. The only part, let me just reiterate, the only part that I side with Microsoft is that I thought it was intuitive and ahead of the curve to say, hey, we're going to start making the internet as part of our operating system. The behaviors and all of that surrounding and beyond that, no, I don't like how they manipulated OEMs. I don't like how they moved to shut out Netscape, so on and so forth. So I'll leave it at that. The other part of it was really outside of the browser itself, but in internet access providers. A lot of Netscape's revenue, beyond what they used to charge for the browser itself, was through server applications and services, of which, again, Microsoft made Internet Information Server free, just pretty much free. It came with the server, and started to work with IAPs and then do licensing again by creating these toolkits that would be specific for Internet Explorer. They did it ahead again of Netscape. I experienced that, and I did enjoy the server the whole server toolkits to work with the browser and branding, all that other stuff ahead of Netscape. And they would make deals again, doing the same kind of licensing as they did with OEMs with these internet access providers, and pretty much making them say, Internet Explorer only, use our toolkit, this is it. So that, again, was on two fronts. Netscape loses its front end on the browser revenue by giving Netscape away for free, but then Microsoft then has a two-pronged attack where they go after them on the server side and again use the same monopolizing tactics with internet access providers. So let me give you an example of saying that, let's say you're an internet access provider. Microsoft doesn't like you because you're promoting Netscape. Well, on Windows, they either make it extremely difficult or eliminate you as a viable internet access provider in a list for a user to select on Windows. But if you happen to embrace Internet Explorer, oh, you get to go into the list. So that's using the power, the monopoly power of Windows through the internet access provider channels, through business and license agreements, and again, blocking Netscape completely. If there's no other operating systems, users will never get to have those internet access providers on a drop-down list for convenience within Windows, and therefore lose the business. What would an internet access provider choose? Well, I guess we're going to support you, because we need to be on that list. So, while there's so much more to the case, the points are that Microsoft interfered in breach of the Sherman Act. I would say that Apple versus Microsoft goes out of its way many times to use open source. It may not be copyleft, but they do provide their own APSL. They do use the BSD licensing. Just about most important technologies within OS X are all open standards. OpenAL, OpenGL, LLVM. Moreover, Apple doesn't use, at least in my developing experience, to say, well, we have a unique flavor to ourselves. and you must develop Java in this fashion, or you must develop this technology in this specific fashion. I would say that Apple can be a pretty good bully with contracts, but they don't use the power of say, another product or an agreement against the other. They have in the past where I would stipulate where they would use peripherals and hardware drives, and they made certain agreements to try to avoid a lawsuit. But to the magnitude of Microsoft, they really don't have a parallel example where they could leverage an operating system or a technology in the size where it would constitute that kind of problem. Even iTunes in itself, you have Amazon competing. They're not interfering with anyone else and saying, well, we're going to prevent you from selling your albums on iTunes if you decide to sell on Amazon MP3s. Or even with the iPhone, they're not saying, well, we're going to interfere. We're going to stop you because you made an application for the iPhone. We're going to stop you from making that application for the BlackBerry, which would be an equivalent. They may say, well, we're not going to share the applications that have already been developed for Apple to be ported over to this place. Leave it up to the developer. I mean, really think about it. There are people that say, well, we want to have access to the App Store. Well, for crying out loud, call up the developers and say, can you develop for us? Essentially. There is nothing prohibiting. Let's say I write an application for the iPhone. There's nothing prohibiting the BlackBerry or BlackBerry from asking me to say, hey, can you develop for us? Or WebOS to say, hey, make an application for us that does the same thing. It's a popular application on iPhone. We'd like to have that over here for our product. Nothing preventing that. It's not interfering with the other trade practices. There are closed environments within Apple, but that mainly comes from Apple saying many times, and I know this, you can either take it the right way or the wrong way. For those that are experienced geeks, it would be more insulting to say, where Apple comes off and says, well, we know more of what the consumer wants, and therefore, to give you a better consumer experience, maybe at a lower denominator, we're going to prevent you from doing this within our operating system. But it's not interfering with any other trade. It's just closed to like things that I would like to see, right? But to maybe an average user, it's not going to be an issue. I could be missing things, but this is what I'm thinking off the top of my head, and mainly the point is about Microsoft and answering my good friend's questions, because he did bring up examples about Apple and then wanted to know what is the deal with the whole United States versus Microsoft. There's a lot more to it, but I hope I summed it up, and thanks for watching.